Everyone knows that The Walking Dead declined in viewership over the years. From the countless, "this show's still on" comments that I've seen hundreds of times to the, "yeah, I stopped watching when they killed this character or that character, when they left the prison, when Negan came, yada yada yada." There's dozens of reasons people give as to why they stopped watching the show, but one thing remains constant across the viewership numbers: they dropped drastically over the course of Season 8. But I can't even blame these people because Season 8 was also the season I stopped watching the show. Yes, I know people find that also surprising, but the reality is Season 8 was just not a great season. It's slow and feels different than the other seasons, and it's just not that exciting. Or so I thought. When it was airing on TV, I watched a few episodes, but it just kinda lost me a few episodes in. I kept up with the show and all that happened during the season, and when Season 9 came on, I decided to start watching it again, and I kept watching all the way through Season 11, but there was still that single season that I had never actually watched. Only read what happens and seen a few of the bigger scenes, but that was it. So I decided to give Season 8 a shot, not expecting anything too major, but what I found was that Season 8 wasn't that bad, at least not with my viewing experience. In today's video, I'm going to be going over the good, the bad, and the ugly in regards to Season 8. Then I'm going to go over why I think this season was truly the season that lost people, and why if you stopped watching during this season, you should give it another shot, because it actually has what I believe to be one of the best episodes in the series, and by far the most underrated episode of the entire show. So let's dive into Season 8 of The Walking Dead. Let's start off with the good, shall we? The first point I want to make is the story itself. While some people don't like the story because it wasn't about survival against the walkers anymore, I see that point, but I also like this war between our group and the Saviors. It shows how far the show has evolved and how human conflict is still a very real issue, even in a post-apocalyptic world. But it's not only the story, it's the structure of the story across the entire season. For the first half of the season, we see Rick's group win battle after battle, trapping the Saviors in their compound and attack several different outposts. It seems like they have the Saviors completely cornered until their own personal conflicts interrupt things. Rick goes to try and get the garbage people on his side once again for some reason, Morgan starts going absolutely insane, and the group makes mistakes. Mistakes that lead to the Saviors getting out and retaliating against them. In the beginning of the second half of the season, the Saviors seem to be on top of this war. They've destroyed a big chunk of Alexandria, and Rick's group is scattered and torn apart. The Saviors hatch a plan, but not everything works due to their own interpersonal issues. The end of the season shows Rick's group winning, but it was a very even war the entire season, and when you look at the bigger picture, it's a very great story. I also have to give a big shout out to the first episode of the season, which was also the show's 100th episode. There are so many great callbacks to the first episode, including the little girl zombie from the first episode, who's even played by the same actress. Not only does it have great callbacks, but it also gives a lot of foreshadowing to the very final episode of the season, something I only realized because I had watched the ending scene beforehand. It's very clever, and I don't think a lot of people even realized it on their first watch, especially if you watched it premiering on TV, because there was a whopping 6 months that went by from the first to the last episode, so you probably wouldn't remember small foreshadowing moments in the first episode. But I'm getting a little bit ahead of myself here. Among the overarching story comes individual storylines of characters, some of which are good, some of which are not, but we're focusing on the good right now, so let's talk about Ezekiel. While only introduced in Season 7, King Ezekiel quickly became a fan favorite. He was this quirky guy with a fun attitude towards the apocalypse and was truly a great leader. That, and he also had this pet tiger that was pretty cool. He also kept his hope and energy with him, and these are all qualities that make for a great leader. This season showed us Ezekiel going against the Saviors with his own people, and he keeps this hope and energy until it's stripped away from him. He realizes that he led all of his people to certain death, and not only his people, but also his cool pet tiger. This sours Ezekiel's mood and makes him feel unfit to be a leader because, in truth, he's just some guy. He has to overcome this feeling and doubt in himself and realize the world he's in, and also how much light he inspires unto those around him. This is a fantastic character arc for Ezekiel to go through, and I'd say it's easily his best arc in the entire show. Another great storyline this season is Rick himself. Now, I'm gonna get to Carl's death, don't you worry, but as it stands, it did add to Rick's character arc throughout the season. Rick is hell-bent on getting revenge against Negan, stooping down to his level at every opportunity he gets. He has no desire to see any other point of view other than his own throughout the entire first half of the season. When Carl dies, Rick doesn't know how to process this, so he just continues on his merciless path. Even when Michonne tries to get him to see reason again, he just won't, and he goes out on his own and runs into Morgan, who's already having his own merciless killing spree, and Rick's wearing his murder jacket, so this can only mean one thing. Yep, that's right, more murder. But after this, Rick sees that he needs to change, and he reads Carl's letter, which gives him a different perspective, even if he doesn't necessarily agree with Carl's. When the moment comes, Rick ultimately realizes Carl is right, and the world needs to move on, and they need a new beginning. As this is Rick's final full season in the show, I think this character arc is very fitting for him to go out on. It does feel a bit like a final chapter, and his next 5 episodes are like the epilogue to his story. Of course, that's not how it truly is, thankfully, but I think that this is a really great arc for Rick in his final full season. I mentioned earlier that there's some trouble at home with the Saviors, and this turned out to be one of my favorite aspects of the season. Simon doesn't agree with Negan's course of action and goes against his orders to try and become the new man in charge. Meanwhile, Dwight is caught between both sides on both sides of the war because he's really with Rick, but he has to act like he's on both sides with Simon and Negan, all while juggling his true intentions. Simon's decisions also get Negan into trouble with Jadis, and these moments also humanize Negan a little bit because we know that he didn't really want these people to die. This internal conflict spreads throughout the entire season and certainly plays a role in Negan ultimately getting defeated in the end, even if it's just showing the rest of the Saviors that their leader is possibly not fit to rule them. Now, I mentioned an episode earlier that I believe to be the most underrated episode of the entire series, and a lot of you probably thought I meant The Key, Season 8, Episode 12. It's a good episode, it's the highest rated episode of the season, but I'm not talking about that episode. I'm talking about the episode directly after it, called Do Not Send Us Astray. I won't get too in-depth about the episode right now because I'll definitely be making an episode analysis on it in the near future, but this episode perfectly encapsulates the entire season. The Saviors attack the hilltop and are run out thinking that they've lost the battle, but they used weapons with walker blood on them, and this infects the wounded of the battle and causes a whole other set of issues within the hilltop. This episode shows how both sides can win and lose at the same time, and that's a great overarching theme of the whole season. You won this battle, but did you really? Was it all worth it? This episode captures that incredibly well, and after I watched the episode, I went to check the rating, and 7.2 is criminally low. I don't usually rate episodes of TV, only ones that really impress me, and this one really impressed me. Honestly, probably a top 10 episode of the show for me overall. Alright, I've talked about the things that were good in Season 8, now let's talk about the bad. Starting out, I know I said the overarching story of Season 8 was good, but the episode pacing itself is absolutely atrocious. This episode has the same problem that Season 7 had, where you would sometimes only focus on one storyline per episode, and if that storyline wasn't interesting, the episode wasn't going to be good. For the first few episodes, it seems like there's very little development other than battles, which is cool, kinda, but it seemed like most of the episodes lacked real sustenance. There was very little, if any, character development, and if there was a bit of character development, the character didn't develop any further until the next episode they were in, which could very well have been in like 5 episodes later. The pacing just didn't work. Watching it week to week was boring because it felt like nothing truly happened. There's a battle, some minor character dies, but are there any real consequences? Sure, there are eventually, but I'll get there. It seems like they wrote this season as a long movie, which is a very popular format nowadays with streaming shows, but this isn't a streaming show. This was a weekly TV episode with commercial breaks. The whole movie formatting thing doesn't work on shows like this. I talked about how episode 1 had foreshadowing to the final episode of the season, but I bet hardly any people even know that because they wouldn't remember such a confusing or throwaway scene they saw 6 months ago. With a movie or a streaming show, you can show the ending at the beginning and have people remember it because they aren't taking 6 months to watch the movie. And sure, maybe this was meant to be caught on rewatches, but how many people are truly rewatching the season after it comes out? And I'm not talking about us, the people who make and watch videos like this. The average casual viewer, most of them will never know that the first episode of season 8 foreshadows the ending. This is a cool scene to have in the first episode, and I'm glad that they included it in now, but at the time this was made, it made no sense to anybody watching, and by the time it would make sense, most people forgot about it already. But that feeling of being confused or uninterested in the show still remains in people's minds, and season 8 was the worst when it comes to aspects like this. Another aspect that was bad in the season was some of the actual battles themselves. Seeing action and guns and explosions is cool, but something about the choreography of the season was different. Maybe because there were so many action sequences that they had less time to prepare and actually choreograph them, but it was extremely noticeable when comparing it to the earlier or even the later seasons. In the episode The Key, we get the climactic showdown between Negan and Rick, but in reality, this showdown is laughably bad. It feels cheap and doesn't even amount to anything. Nobody even gets hurt at all. Seeing Rick fight Negan is cool, but this wasn't cool. Now, I talked about how great Rick and Ezekiel's storylines were, but there was a storyline that I found majorly boring, and that's Daryl. Daryl's story this season is easily the worst story that Daryl has across all seasons of the show. I first thought that I felt this way because I was used to seeing Daryl as the leading role of the show, but I also realized that this isn't true because Daryl has great storylines in earlier seasons. But man, every Daryl-centric moment in the season was truly boring. This has a lot to do with another character, so let's move on to the next section of the video, the ugly portion of season 8. I'm talking about Dwight's storyline, because Daryl is, for some reason, tied very closely with this storyline. Dwight's story itself, like I mentioned before in The Good, is one of my favorite aspects of this season. Dwight having to play like 3 sides at once, and the side he's actually on mostly hates him, is such an interesting plotline, and it's done, for the most part, really well. But the ugly side of this storyline is everything having to do with Daryl. Dwight and Daryl have this sort of half-baked rivalry, like they were trying to have them be the 2 sides of the same coin, Batman-Joker style, but it just never felt like fully developed to me. It started in season 6 and continued in season 7, and in season 8, Daryl hates Dwight and looks for every opportunity to turn against him. I get this motivation from Daryl, I really do, but even Tara was saying, no, Dwight's here to help us after she didn't like him. She moved on and saw that he was, in fact, on their side, but for some reason, Daryl just could never do that. Daryl banishes him at the end of the season, even after Negan literally announces that no, Dwight was actually on your side and we just caught on to his plan. It seemed like Dwight got the bad end of the stick when he was actually trying to help Rick and the group the entire time. Eugene was actively working against them for a large part of the season, and yet he's still welcomed back, not with open arms, but he's still welcomed back. I think I'm very angry with how the storyline ended because it truly was one of my favorite aspects of this season, and Dwight was one of my favorite characters. And I know Dwight goes off to Fear, but that doesn't change my mind at all in regards to the ending of this season. Speaking of characters that moved over to Fear, let's talk about Morgan. Morgan is and always will be one of the most interesting and confusing characters to have ever been on The Walking Dead. We first met him in the pilot, and he was a great character in that episode, and everybody was looking out for him. Where was he going to be next? The next time we saw him was in season 3, and he's absolutely insane. He's teased to be on the tracks of Rick all throughout season 5, and in season 6, he's finally one of the principal cast members. But he's not crazy, and he doesn't want to kill anybody because he believes all life is precious. It's definitely a different take than everybody else has, and it spins out some great storylines in season 6. But in season 7, he kills again, and he goes completely overboard in season 8, turning into the crazy Morgan we saw in season 3 all over again, if not even worse. But just having Morgan go insane doesn't make for a good story. He sees dead people everywhere and has these crazy manic episodes, but what for? For him to leave at the end of the season? It just felt like the writers didn't really know what to do with Morgan now that he had been around for a little while, so they turned him insane. And I know he goes over to Fear. I can't speak on what he does on that show. I have no idea. I don't watch it. But Morgan is such an interesting character, and it feels like his time, especially in season 8, was ultimately wasted. And now for the big one. The one everybody talks about. The one thing that season 8 is known for. Scott. No, I'm kidding. I'm obviously talking about Carl. Killing off Carl was when The Walking Dead took a major hit. This was, and to this day stands, as the biggest change from the comic book to the show, and it is easily their worst change. Carl was never my favorite character, but he was extremely important. He was Rick's son. Everything that Rick did was ultimately for Carl, and having him gone meant that Rick also didn't really have to be around any longer either. Sure, Rick continued on after Carl, but it truly could have been the other way around. If Rick was going to leave the show regardless, and they didn't want to pay Chandler Riggs to be in the show any longer, you could keep that 6-year time jump in season 9 and then just recast him. It's not ideal whatsoever, but killing off Carl was the show's biggest mistake. It made Rick and a lot of the group itself feel a bit meaningless. And as Carl's last season, you'd expect him to go out on a high note, be a primary character and contributing factor of the season, right? Well, it's kind of hard to do that when you're only in 4 episodes of the entire season. Yes, that's right, Carl is only actually in episodes 1, 6, 8, and 9. If anything, this is proof of just how little Carl was utilized and how little they cared for the character itself. A lot is said about Chandler Riggs acting as Carl. Everyone can have their own opinion, but mine is that Carl should have been the leading man after Rick left. There's forever this stained memory of Carl dying, and it's truly the main reason why season 8 is the lowest rated season of the show. I think most people left after Carl died. Even if you didn't like the character or Chandler Riggs' portrayal, there was absolutely no denying how important Carl was. On the flip side of things, like I mentioned with Rick's character arc, as the story stands, it absolutely does all make sense. Rick was never going to have his mind changed unless a big change personally happened for him, and it just so happened that that personal change was Carl's death. But this is a double-edged sword, because with Carl gone and Rick doing everything he can for the communities, it didn't feel like Rick had to be in the show anymore if Carl wasn't. Would I have liked for Rick to be in the show? Yes, absolutely, but as the story stands right now, everything does line up and it all makes sense. Carl dying forced Rick and Negan to change. Rick leaves because he doesn't have Carl anymore, and Negan treats Judith with respect because he sees her as a little Carl. While the season made a lot of mistakes, it's important to note that the story all adds up. It does make sense, it's just how it got there wasn't that satisfying. So why did I watch season 8? Why did I enjoy it now after I didn't all those years ago? There's a very simple answer, and as stupid as it might sound, it's binge watching. This season was a chore to sit through week to week. It was boring, it was slow, you didn't even see all your favorite characters in every episode, but watching it on Netflix tells a very different story. If there's a boring episode or you didn't see Rick, well, you can just watch the next one interruption free. If there's 2 or 3 meh episodes, but the next one is genuinely good, then it makes those meh episodes and the next couple meh episodes not all that bad. It allows you to see the season as one big picture because everything starts to blend together. The lines between episodes get crossed, and maybe Rick was in the episode, I just didn't notice it, but waiting a whole week to not see Rick or another favorite character was very noticeable. So if you stopped watching during the season, or if you didn't like it when it was on TV, I'd encourage you to go back and rewatch it now. Is this season on par with the earlier seasons? No, absolutely not, but it's not nearly as bad as I thought it would be, or how people say it is. At the very least, you get to see a great Rick Grimes story, and after seasons 10 and 11, seeing Rick Grimes in mostly every episode is a real great feeling. What are your thoughts on season 8? Do you agree that it's not that bad, or do you think it's absolutely terrible? And seriously, if you're going to watch at least just a single episode, you should watch Do Not Send Us Astray. And if you believe this season is good, or if this episode is good, go rate it on IMDb. I want to see if we can get the score raised even just by 0.1%. There's only 7K votes on it, and I feel like we could easily raise it if people actually vote on it. If you enjoyed the video, let me know that by pressing the like button, and subscribe for more videos like this. If you do, then I'll see you in the next one.
Yeah.